Let's get going. Let's talk about voting options. And when we start there, let's talk about the length of campaign. There was a congressman from Maryland, a gentleman by the name of Delaney. And Mr. Delaney declared himself to be a candidate for the presidency of the United States 1,100 days ago. And you ask yourself, well, who's Delaney? Well, obviously he's dropped out of the contest, but he was the first official candidate, aside from the incumbent president, to declare for the presidency for 2020. Compare that with Israel. Israel has a cap on the number of days that its campaign can last, 101 days. And there is that great disparity between American politics and politics around the world. But that's just one country. How about Australia? My wife loves to point out Australia and say, why can they just limit their elections? And I always come back to her and say, well, look at the geography. The geography is different. The population is different. And then we start from there. But we have other comparisons as well. Britain, their campaign is only 42 days. Canada, less. France, 2 weeks. Japan, under 2 weeks. Singapore, only 9 days. And you ask yourself, how can you conduct an election in 9 days? How can you consider a candidate fully in 9 days? How can they be vetted? Well, the matter is pretty simple. You're really not voting for the candidate, you are voting for the party. And by then you should be fully aware of the platform that a party represents. So it's not personality so much, it is the party that you are electing. There is the big difference between the length of campaigns in the United States and in other countries. Also, people say that maybe an alternative would be to have regional campaigns where candidates would only campaign in the South, the Northeast, the West, etc. And in that respect, it could be shortened and people and the candidates would not be traipsing all over the country. Now, what we historically and traditionally have been talking about is just referred to as in-person voting. That's where people just show up on the day or maybe a few days before. That's in-person voting. And of course you get the little sticker. Some people have said that should be a national holiday in that we should dedicate ourselves primarily to that one event. So what has happened is if you were dedicating yourself to that, you would have crowded polls. So the idea came up with early voting. In other words, let's open up the polling places days, even weeks. In fact, it's got to the point where we've already began voting, have we not, in certain states? So up to 46 days before an election, the polls are available to voters in certain states. And that is a conundrum in itself, in that every state is charged with their own system. It would probably be preferable that there would be a one size fits all for all states, but it being the United States, we don't do it that way. In our county, in the county of San Luis Obispo, there's a number of instruments that allow us to follow our ballots. For example, you can go online to the county clerk, the registrar, excuse me, and you can go to this site and you can make sure that your ballot is going to be counted. Furthermore, if you want to know, has your ballot been counted, you can find it after the fact at Where's My Ballot. Now, there are a number of counties in California that have signed up for this system, and I am assured that this county is on this system as well. So if you want to find out after the fact, did my signature match the signature that they have on file? Did I have the proper procedures followed? It is available on Where's My Ballot. And if you're one of the religious people that take notes and are writing this down, let me assure you that this recording is going to be available to you either on our site or something we're going to try with YouTube. So you'll be able to get a recording of this presentation later on.
Great.
Now, there is a difference, and people are confused between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. First of all, the difference is that absentee ballots, you request your ballot. And in California, traditionally, that is what we do, because you have the option. You're of the minds, I'm going to show up and I'm going to vote traditionally in person. Or no, I'm not sure what's going to be happening that day. I want to take out insurance, and frankly, I need more time. So I would like to request an absentee ballot. And that's what many states have had. But mail-in ballots is another term referred to where states like California this year in 2020 is sending ballots to all registered voters. People mistake this when they say that California is sending ballots to all voters. That is not true. They are being sent to registered voters, whether you request it or not, and that is controversial in some places. Now, the interesting part is that this all began with troops who were overseas and could not vote. So then the idea of the absentee ballot was born. Now, what's happened is that the idea has been expanded, as you can see, to at least 35 states. And it's got to the point where the requirements for absentee ballots were so strict that there has been a new term born. It's called no excuse absentee voting, which means in the past you had to qualify to get an absentee ballot. And more states are going in the route of having no excuses. I'm going to have to do some housekeeping here, so bear with me.
Now what?
It sounds fun. It's just that I had to wipe out some videos because I'm getting a lot of videos from people on the side. So what you want to do in your controls down below is you not only want to mute yourself, but you also want to shut off your video, because I'm getting video on my screen. It's obscuring my screen. Now, what's happening is that in some states, you still have to fill out an application. And people say that's a check on absentee voting, as opposed to voter suppression, in that we want to make sure that you are actually asking for an absentee ballot, as opposed to some states who have decided to vote to send them out automatically. So, like everything else, you can register online. You can even register in some states on the day of election, on the day that you will cast your ballot. And I thought it was interesting. Let's take a look locally at the vote count. First of all, we have 172,000 registered voters in the county of San Luis Obispo. Of those people who are registered in San Luis Obispo, we had a huge turnout. Historically speaking, over 128,000 people voted in the election of 2018, which is called an off-year election. And historically, those numbers are much less than you would get in a general election, which is held every 4 years, also referred to as the presidential election. Here's our percentage. High for any state, but certainly very high for the state of California. Now, of those 128,000 people, 97,000 people voted by mail. So you can see that the number has been increasing over the years. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I remember listening to newscasts in the past, and the point was made that Republicans voted by absentee mail in greater numbers than did Democrats. And it might interest you to know that now the sides have switched, and that now more Democrats vote by mail as opposed to Republicans. But here is the percentage of people who vote by mail in San Luis Obispo County. So you can see the challenge that lies before Mr. Gong, our registrar for this county. Now, it might serve you well to know that some places like Florida, for example, when they receive their absentee votes, they will start counting. So they can start counting up to 21 days before the election occurs. Consequently, this fear that we may not know for a month or months after the election what the outcome of the election may not come to bear, and because some of the states will have prepared ahead of time. California does not count their votes prior to the day of the election. They come via mail, their absentee ballots. How do we stack up with the rest of California? Pretty good. We're 10 points in front of the rest of California. The Central Coast takes its voting requirements seriously, much farther ahead than the United States. But experts are saying that this whole number is going to dramatically increase this year because of the publication and also because of COVID. So only half the people vote by mail in the United States, or they did in the last election of 2018. Now, all mail voting, that's that term used where the state of California, for example, sends its ballots to all registered voters. So it's going to be automatic. You're not going to have to request it. And some other terms that are used for it are all mail voting and universal vote by mail. Now, notice that here's the breakdown. So in states where you say, well, the governor holds a lot of power, well, you've got almost an equal number of states in the United States with Republican governors as opposed to Democratic governors. And this chart shows us how the breakdown occurs as to who will allow mail-in voting as opposed to absentee voting, as opposed to in-person voting. And it's a little bit busy, so I'll interpret it for you. The dark, represented by the states to the west, have a more progressive, I guess you could say, idea of people using mail-in voting. And that does not say that you cannot vote by mail, as the light states are represented, but they are absentee votes, which once again means that you have to request it as opposed to automatically receiving the ballots. People say, this is not something new. These states have done it historically, and they're looking at these states. Other states, for example, I was listening to NPR. There was a broadcast that featured the Secretary of State from Washington. She's fielding calls from all over the country as to how to pull off an election largely made up of mail votes. Now, this is the lengths to which some states require their voters to go to ensure the integrity of an election. Now, notice that at the bottom, they can be submitted via mail or designated drop-off locations. And I listened to a response from the Postmaster General the other day, and he said that We don't need to have drop-off locations when you have a drop-off location on your corner. He was referring to mailboxes. But then again, I saw that mailboxes were being taken away in droves. Now, here are the pros and cons of all mail voting. Me, once again, you are not having to request it. First of all, the pros. Washington, Oregon, Hawaii, they already have this. And fraud is almost non-existent.
Small, not many people.
It increases the turnout. Greater numbers, Washington and Oregon have recorded greater numbers of voting because it is so convenient. Now, here's perhaps a bone of contention in that the other side says it's more expensive, but the point is it is cheaper in the long run. It is safer, certainly in this era of COVID, so that you can vote from home. Now, what's wrong with it? What's the downside? Well, you're at home. You're at home. And unlike the in-person voting, when you are in the privacy of a booth, there can be some give and take. Your significant other can bully you, can coerce you into changing your voting. There are a number of different downsides to that. In that, the number of people, the type of people who are going to be receiving ballots are fraught with inaccuracies. There have been histories of people who have passed who are receiving ballots. That in the long run, maybe it's new and it's the new toy and people will vote by mail now, but in the long run, people who oppose all mail voting say this is going to fall off. And it is expensive to set up. The pro side doesn't argue with that, but remember, they're saying in the long run, it's cheaper. And it takes a lot of security to make sure that this is pulled off. So the two sides to all mail voting. And of course, people are saying, you're not going to know the results of the 2020 election for weeks or maybe months. They like to point to the election of New York. In that New York took weeks to determine the winners in their election. And they're saying, see, there is the canary in the coal mine. So I collected some data from the ACLU on the effects or the efforts across the country to suppress voting. So I worked at it backwards, kind of. Okay, let's first of all, let's look to see who had the highest turnouts in voting. And we looked at some states because there are people that always look at the Southeast, at some states who they think are sometimes behind the times. But I think all of us would admit that those were not the states that we probably had in mind for people who had low rates, but instead high rates. All right, but all five of them introduced voter suppression laws. Now that's interesting. Why would they want to suppress their votes when they already had the highest rates? Interesting enough, it's not just those five. But it's not just the states that introduce voter suppression, but it's those states that actually pass the measures of suppression in their legislature. So, tomatoes, tomatoes, it depends on what you're talking about. In that, if you're talking about, you're accusing one state of voter suppression, they're saying, no. We just value our vote. We are looking out for the security of the vote, the integrity of the vote. You may not care. You may be more casual about it, but we are going to actually be more interested in how secure our vote is.
Chicago says,
What?
Chicago says, you know, as a
Right, here's some suppression tactics used for voter registration. California has same-day registration. Maine has eliminated. In other words, you can no longer in Maine on that day register to vote.
Hey, they can take you to the poll and have you register. It's ridiculous.
Ohio has done likewise. There are only so many days in which you can conduct voter registrations in Florida and Texas, and can only be done in certain manners. And if you move, you can lose the right to vote in the states of Florida and Wisconsin. Now, this is interesting. All right. Why the big deal about registering voters? Well, it just turns out that that's the way you reach the Hispanic and African American voter. They're more likely to vote if you reach out to them as opposed to white voters. So when you suppress voter registration, you suppress that vote. Here are the numbers. They react to voter registration drives. Well, how about early voting? Certainly there couldn't be a problem with showing up early to vote. It would lessen the crowds at the polls. Well, here are the numbers in 2004. That was the amount of early voting in 2004. 2016, you can see that it's doubled. All of a sudden, people are getting accustomed to showing up prior to the traditional day. Now, if you restrict early voting, you are going to be affecting 54% of the vote here. And it's 2 southern states. Ten states introduced the legislation, but they were passed. They were passed in Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Tennessee, West Virginia. To what degree? Well, in Florida, they were cut a week. In other words, you can request your absentee ballot with less time. Very dramatic in Georgia, half the time. Ohio, half the time.
Good for Ohio.
So you might ask yourself, why is this occurring? Why would people make it more difficult for people to vote? And there again is the other side of the argument, in that because we want to make sure that voter security is increased, not decreased. How about the voter ID? I think most people say, how hard is it to get voter ID? Let me share with you a story. Recently, my wife and I wanted to complete our health directive. And I didn't know if any of you have tried to do that of late, but you require 2 non-family witnesses to sign the directive. And you would think, how hard could that be? Well, in the days of COVID, it is much harder. So to make a long story short, it took us about 3 to 4 weeks to get it done. And you say to yourself, what does that have to do with voter ID? Well, what seems to be mundane and easy for some is very difficult for others. If you are a person that lives in a rural area with no transportation, perhaps no phone, no legal address, then obtaining voter ID is a huge challenge.
Ah.
Anyway, some states say you require voter ID in order to cast a ballot. And these states tightened their ID laws. And it's not too long ago. Now, of course, the other argument is here again, why can't we get a national ID so that the states will not have their differing requirements? I found this surprising. You would think it would be commonplace. All of us have ID, right? Not so. 10% of Americans do not. And it jumps to 25% when you're talking about ID for African Americans. They don't have a photo ID. So you would be restricting their access to ballots.
I do the photo ID.
We don't have photo ID.
Huh?
We don't have photo
So you can
ID.
see why
First we-
Huh?
minority people have a harder time than do whites in receiving or obtaining ID.
A DMV ID photo.
I'm on the paper.
And across the board, people that earn less also would have a greater challenge in order to obtain ID. In some states, their registrar, their secretary of state, has had a campaign to get rid of people and get their names off of voter rolls. Okay, what are the excuses? Why do they do that? Well, people die. People die. And you don't want that ballot, let's say the state of California, where someone has died, to be in the hands of somebody who would fill it out and return it. Or how about people who have failed to vote in any recent elections, or people who have moved? I often talk to students from Cal Poly who have to make the decision, where am I going to vote? Am I going to vote here in San Luis Obispo, where I'm a student, or back home? So there is inaccurate data out there. So people have properly been purged from voter rolls, but that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're talking about people who should not have been purged. And you know that of late, Florida had to make a decision on people with felony convictions. They do not have the right to vote until they have satisfied all the requirements, having paid, for example, any monetary charges that had to be paid upon their conviction. In the state of California, one of its propositions is going to deal with that very question. If you have been released from jail, but you have not completed parole, you are not allowed to vote. The proposition is going to allow people who have been released from jail, but have not completed their parole time to be allowed to vote.
Of course, that's what they want.
17% of those people who were purged in Virginia were purged in error. And when we're talking about 39,000 people, and you say, well, 75 million people are going to vote for a president, so that's infinitesimal. Yes, but that might have a great deal to do with the final result in Virginia. Wisconsin in the last election, 2016, was razor thin. 39,000 votes could make the difference. Let's find out what this gentleman has to say about.
Some Ohio voters are concerned that their vote won't count this election. There is no question that the 2020 election will be highly anticipated for people across the country, which would mean there should be a large amount of people at the polls. Well, not if you're a voter who was purged. What does that mean? That means that you will have to register again to vote because you were not active in voting or due to a technical error. Purging has been challenged in the minds of many because they believe the system is biased towards
So poorly run, isn't it?
This famously took place on the national Georgia governor's race, where one Secretary of State who ran the electoral system at the time and purged many voters before the election between him and his African American opponent. It would be inaccurate to say that voter purging is the only reason minority voters are not voting. One reason that you could classify as a bigger reason for minority voters not voting is the decrease in
Yeah, that's what
confidence
that kid is saying.
candidates, but in the system itself. There is more to this story. According to an article in the New York Times, Ohio had more than 200,000 voters wrongly purged. That is 200,000 out of Ohio's 11 million residents. The Secretary of State's office encourages people to check the list to see if they were wrongly purged, even though they shouldn't be wrongly purged in the first place. So what needs to be done? I will leave that up to the voters. Reporting in Toledo, I'm Jaden Jefferson. Some Ohio voters.
There's a term that's often misunderstood. It's called one man, one vote. And when you first tell people that, then they're going to say, well, that's obvious. That means you can only vote once. No, that's not what it means. What it means is that every person's vote should be valued equally, should carry the same weight. So I may not be able to get rid of your right to vote and suppress in that manner, but I can make it so that your vote does not carry the same weight as somebody else's. So that gets us to the subject of gerrymandering. What is gerrymandering? All right, that's when you take a district's boundaries, and they're changed every 10 years, so that your party will receive an advantage. Because in every state, the state's legislature will decide how those boundaries will be drawn. In fact, the state legislature does it in the majority of states of the country. So you want to keep score. All right, of those states, how many are controlled by Republicans and how many controlled by Democrats? Well, there's your scoreboard. Nebraska is unicameral, which means there's only going to be one legislative body. California has 2 legislative bodies. Most states are bicameral. We have the Assembly and the State Senate in California. All right. Let's say your state has a divided membership, which is like a lot of states. For example, California has so many more Democrats registered than Republicans. In fact, it's getting to the point where independents are going to outnumber Republicans. So let's say that your state does not have an advantage in numbers. And your legislature is going to be able to draw the district boundaries to make sure that even though you don't have the majority in party registrations, you will still maintain power in your state. So for the example that we're going to show you here to teach you gerrymandering, let's assume that there's districts in this state. And each district includes 5 precincts. So I'm going to do that by giving you a grid. So trust me, there are 45 R's representing the Republican Party and 45 D's representing the Democratic Party. So in this case, you have an even numbered. So let's say your party, the Republican Party, controls the state legislature. How are you going to draw boundaries so that your state can be guaranteed to re-elect Republican representatives year after year? Well, perhaps the first state would be to isolate your opponent, the Democrats. Now, in this example, they're Democrats. Of course, they could be Republican, or you could isolate a certain minority group. So that's the first step in making sure that you will always have control of your state by isolating the districts so that those precincts that control your adversary are collected together. So what happens is that you will maintain a majority. Remember, each district has 5 precincts, so the majority would be 3. And if you look at all these different colors up there, you will see that the boxes have to be contiguous. In other words, they have to touch each other because the districts are all one landmass. But your party, in my example, the Republican Party, would be 3 of every 5 districts. And you would control this state year after year after year. And since your state legislature determines the boundaries for the next election, then you will continuously win. This would never end. Let me give you an example of what our district used to look like. There is California in 2010, based on the last election, okay? There was Lois Capps. Prior to the census of 2010, Lois Capps' district was this district that ran down the coast. Historically, Democrats live on the coasts. So consequently, if you want to ensure that Lois Capps will have what's referred to as a safe district, that safe district will include Democrats on the West Coast. And it undulates all the way down the coast, and then will be in Santa Barbara as well, and include the Channel Islands. And if you're just curious, where was Kevin McCarthy at the time? Well, if you lived in North County, you lived in Atascadero, Paso Robles, etc., you were in McCarthy's district. So what's happened since then? Well, first of all, in 2010, there was Proposition 20. And Proposition 20 did away with gerrymandering in the state of California, because now there was a body of equal number Democrats and Republicans, independents on this commission. Now, that body, 8 commissioners, they chose another 6 for a total of 14. And those 14 people, not the state legislature, drew the new boundaries. So you can say that California does not have gerrymandering, except that Republicans will still complain, and perhaps the basis of their complaint is that there are almost twice as many Democrats as there are Republicans. It's very difficult to draw a district which would favor Republicans. And the result is that we have so many more Democratic members of the House and so many more members of the Senate as well. Now, if you're curious, what does Kevin McCarthy's district look like in 2020? Well, he's moved east. He no longer has any district in the North County. He's gone east, but even then, it's kind of curious that he has this island there around Bakersfield, which you can say maybe there's still a little hint of gerrymandering there. But of course, it's not the party anymore that does it. It is this commission that draws the districts in California. And this is the present 24th district, no longer that strip on the coast. It is more of a block. This is Salud Carbajal's 24th district. And all this is based on the census, the counting of the people. They came about from the Constitution. Article 1. Article 1 has to do with Congress. Congress is tasked to count the people in the United States. Fancy term at that time, enumeration, which just simply means counting. But I highlighted in such manner as they shall by law direct. So things can change. But This is Article 1, dealing with Congress, not Article 2, dealing with the executive, the chief executive, the president. So I want to make that distinction. When the counting occurs, the census then will determine the representatives in the House of Representatives. So if people leave California and move elsewhere, California will lose representation, and the other states to which our Californians move will gain representatives. Here's the scorecard. Those states which will gain. Now, as you notice, Florida, if the projections are correct, because of course we don't have the 2020 census yet, Florida will be 2 representatives richer. Texas will gain 3. Now, if you're the person who keeps score, red and blue, you might feel that is a negative. Texas picking up 3 seats. But the pundits are coloring the state Texas purple, which means they predict that Texas will be a blue state in the future, and you will have picked up 3 electoral votes if that's what you're keeping score on. Who's going to lose votes? We're in the list of losers. And I thought there's some interesting states in there. For example, I would not think that people would be leaving Alabama. I thought that the southern states were all gaining in population. I am wrong. But the question is, will the census be accurate? The fact that it has ceased ahead of schedule is going to be changing this. So, why is it important? First of all, programs, in that money is earmarked in Congress for certain programs, but it is aimed at a certain classification of people, whether they be poor or minority, and you have to count them in your state in order to be eligible. So the federal funding is incumbent upon the way the census is counted. Now, there was some controversy about citizenship. That has gone by the boards. There's got to be no question on citizenship in the new census. The federal courts found that it violated administrative law. You cannot ask, is this person a citizen of the United States? Because the Constitution does not say anything about citizenship. Just all people are to be counted. Had the original July deadline. Like everything else this year, it was moved up. But then it was suspended. And there would be some rationale, some logic behind that. You don't want your representatives knocking on doors on the day of COVID. But as always, it seems like the people in the rural communities are going to be the most affected. Later on, we're going to touch upon the post office. And it seems like always the people in the farm communities are going to be hurt most when government programs are suspended. There has been a concern about, well, how are we going to regulate these campaigns? They're getting out of hand. And certainly in 1971, with Nixon and Watergate, people said, this has to be reined in. There has to be some oversight. So they wanted to say there has to be a limit as to how much money is involved in these campaigns. Certainly these campaigns must tell us how much they raise and what do they spend their money on. So as a result, the FEC was born, the Federal Election Commission. So we're talking about delaying the election because of COVID, because of fears of security. And as I said before, a lot of the election and the election rules are determined by the states, but the Electoral College is determined by Congress. They are the people who will determine when the electors will meet. And there is unanimity across the United States. And as such, there's usually a day for this. It's the Tuesday after the first Monday in November is when we have our elections, right? But here is the kicker. Delay the election if you like, but we must have a new president by January 20th. So all you're going to do is you're going to cut the time if you delay the election between the date of the election and the day of reckoning, noon on the 20th day of January. Now, believe it or not, at one point we were not definitive as to what would happen if the president and even the vice president were to perish. So we put into law not only the fact that the vice president would be succeeding, but, and this is irony of ironies, if President Trump or any president were to delay the election, first of all, their term would end regardless on noon of January 20th. And since their vice president would be on that ballot, by default, the next president of the United States, if President Trump wants to delay this election and there is no final decision, the president of the United States would be Republicans. Pelosi will be the president of the United States if we delay the election to the point there is no answer. There is no final solution. Let's talk about the Electoral College. Each state collects votes, and do I have to do that? You're really not voting for the candidate. You're voting for their electoral delegates. So California is going to be meeting on December 14th, 2020, California's Electoral College voters. If we, let's say, and I think it's pretty much a foregone conclusion, that we will vote Democrat, and that means that the Biden electoral voters will meet in Sacramento and they will cast their ballot on December 14th, 2020. Then all respective states will send their votes to Washington. And there is going to be a meeting on January 6th. Historically and traditionally, it's January 6th. If it falls on a Sunday, it can be moved to the following day. And I want you to note, because this is important for our discussion, Congress, the new Congress, is sworn in 3 days before that. So any mechanisms that I'm going to be explaining in the short future refer to the new Congress. So there are projections that the Democrats will maintain control of the House. They'll have an advantage there. And there are some people who are saying that Democrats will also wrest control of the Senate. So I want you to keep that in mind. Anyway, they're all going to meet in a joint session. What does that mean? That means the Senate and the House come together. That's all 538 of them. 435 members of the House, 100 senators, and 3 members from DC. So they show up at a ceremony in the House of Representatives, and the vice president opens up the individual ballots from the respective states. They're announced by state in alphabetical order. So there's plenty of transparencies, but wait a minute. There's still some suspense. First of all, Vice President Pence can refuse to what's the word? Well, to respect the electoral votes from an individual state if he has reasons to think that that particular state's election was rigged. I know you have plenty of nightmares to think about already, and here Ed is giving you another one, but I'm trying to give you the background on how the Electoral College works. Well, it was interesting in my research, somebody irresponsibly just noted this without reporting the mechanism for how this would proceed. And what happens is that this question is then sent back to the House, sent back to the Senate. They meet in their own individual areas, and they determine whether, in fact, the results of that individual state are valid or not. And then they come back. They come back. So it isn't just Pence who has the power to decide that some states' votes are invalid. All right, so it's a game of chess. If for some reason this word got out that Vice President Pence was going to do that, and let's face it, secrets are very hard to keep in Washington, D.C., then Pelosi would have her move. She could refuse, and it should be Pelosi and not Pence, could refuse to allow the vice president to take the gavel. So there would be no joint session. Now, speak of confidence in our government. First of all, there would be one side who would be upset with Pence for determining that a state certificate was fraudulent. But there would be another side that would be upset with Pelosi, who would not allow Pence to bring these charges forward. So there'd be a lot of controversy. And you say to yourself, what a mess. Where have we gotten to? It's just getting worse all the time. Well, I love to tell my students, if you think things are bad now, you'll want to study some history. In this case in point, 1876. The election is versus the Democrat Tilden and the Republican Hayes. This is just a little over a decade after the Civil War. It's important to note. It is a tight election, so tight that it's thrown into Congress's hands. Now, to note that if there can be no resolution, if neither side gets the necessary number of votes, today it's 270 electoral votes, then Congress has to make the decision. Each state will have one vote per state. So Florida has one vote, Rhode Island has one vote, California has one vote. So it determines how many representatives from either party has the majority in that state. Anyway, there was no resolution in 1876, not days, not weeks, but months, no resolution. They were deadlocked. So it turns out that Tilden's base was the southern states. It was the time of Reconstruction. There were still some federal troops in the South. The South wanted them out. They wanted to return to their old traditional ways. And they wanted Reconstruction to come to an immediate end. So In the end, the Southerners who backed Tilden ran the great deal, and they gave the election to Hayes with the guarantee that they would be able to end Reconstruction. So there was a fear that there would be a second civil war. The situation was so tense, but it was ended. Now, one of their answers was that, one of the facades was that they were going to set up a special commission. They would have 5 members of the Supreme Court of the 9, 5 senators, and 5 members of the House from representing both parties. And they were hoping that this mechanism would bring an end to the controversy. And the only reason I mention that is that this idea is being floated around now, but it would have to be done soon in order to ensure the legitimacy of this next election. Now, what's the rationale behind delaying the election? First of all, again, I'm going to have to refer to history, the history of 1952, when President Truman wanted to seize the steel mills. He said, hey, we're in the middle of the Korean War. This is a national catastrophe. You cannot have a strike, steel workers. We're going to have to seize the steel mills because you cannot conduct a war without steel. We're talking about national security. The Supreme Court says, nope, nope. The power to seize steel mills does not rest in the hands of the executive branch. It is the power to Congress alone. And the excuse of national catastrophe and national security did not fly. And people are saying, well, in that same manner, the election of 2020 cannot be delayed, even with the chief executive pointing to reasons of national security. It looks like we've run out of time today. I am so sorry about all the technical difficulties. I think we ironed them out. We shall finish a week from today. And if you have questions on anything that I've said today, please send them to me. My email is maestro, M-A-E-S-T-R-O, 6225 at hotmail.com. You received an email from me, so you can respond to that, asking me any questions or perhaps giving me tips on cleaning up my technical side. So thank you for joining us today. We shall see you next Tuesday, 10 o'clock. Adios.